All right. Well, thank you very much for joining today's webinar. We've got a great group packed in today. We've got a lot of people who have signed up. It's a full house, so we want to go ahead and get started. We've got a hard stop at 12 o'clock. So thank you for joining our webinar today about challenges of sourcing the 5 key industrial components in Mexico. Okay, so here's kind of a brief overview of the plan today. I have a brief introduction of East West and Harris Frickin, who are the 2 sponsors who will be speaking today. We'll be introducing this. Then we'll go to the webinar series. This is the second in a 3-part webinar series. Then we're going to introduction to 2 core speakers, Carlos Flores and Gary Zanka. We'll have a brief discussion about where China and Mexico are right now. Then we open up to the main event, which is a Q&A discussion really with Gary and Carlos for about 45 minutes, taking questions and answers from people all throughout the webinar. And so just as people are looking at this, recognize that you have on your control panels an area to hit questions. So please fill out those questions. I'll have a reminder in a minute, but fill out the questions, type the questions to me, and then I will ask the speakers for them. So with that, we'll kind of jump right on into this. The next step is we'll give a brief introduction of East West. I'm Alex Bryant, president of East West Associates. I'll moderate today's event that we've got in front of us. East West itself operates in 5 markets: US, China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Central Eastern Europe. We do primarily 2 core things. We got major developer of global supply chain and manufacturing footprint strategies. And then secondly, we implement on the ground in the 5 markets of China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe. We focus primarily on operational, supply chain, commercial, and risk management efforts. Operational will be everything related to running the factory. A lot of executive search work to bring in the right senior personnel, a lot of performance improvements of existing facilities to improve their manufacturing capabilities, operational organizational assessments and right sizing primarily now in Chinese facilities. And then we're doing a lot of closing and relocations globally of different facilities. On the supply chain work, it's identifying suppliers, qualifying suppliers, supplier audits, supplier improvement projects. On the commercial side, that's everything related to the top growth of the business, identifying competitors, go-to-market strategies, and then evaluating them against our own clients' commercial capabilities. And then finally, the risk management strategies. That's quite relevant in the markets where we play. And we've got a team of ex-policemen and military who do a lot of background checks for us, covert background checks, some overt, primarily of new suppliers, which is quite relevant today, and also new employees. On suppliers, what we're primarily looking for, we're doing a covert background check on the suppliers, is to find out really who owns it, what has been their history of getting sued, what its history of working. We're trying to make sure that for our clients who are looking at suppliers, that oftentimes we find out they may have 2 or 3 suppliers and find out they're owned by the same family, which is not a good place to be. All the EWA executives have held senior management positions, P&L responsibilities. They all come up in different functional skill sets, whether it's supply chain, procurement, human resources, manufacturing. But then they all went on to have P&L responsibilities to running a company on the ground in our 5 markets. So here's where the 5 markets where we operate. That's kind of the global reach of East West and where our team members are located. Now I'm going to turn it over to Fred Rocafort, give a brief introduction of Harris Frickin.
Well, thanks, Alex, and good morning to everyone. Harris Frickin is an international law firm. We have offices in the United States, in Mexico, in China, and Spain. As a matter of fact, many in the audience might be familiar with our China law blog. That's often that reputation often precedes the firm's name itself, and as that could lead you to correctly deduce, for many years our firm has been working with companies going into China, and we still do, but of course in recent years we have been increasingly working with companies that are leaving China and relocating to places like Mexico. So it's a pleasure to be on today's panel, and turn it back to you, Alex.
Okay, Well, great. As we talked about, Harris Bricken and East West is a webinar series. Today's webinar is the second in a three-part series. The first webinar was on May 24th. That was around China plant closures, relocations, consolidations, and that was primarily for companies who are downsizing or consolidating their Chinese manufacturing plants, as evident by this trend to diversify supply chain and manufacturing to Mexico. Today's focus will obviously be on the challenges of these five particular areas, five key components, sourcing that out of Mexico. We have a webinar tomorrow with Harris Bricken, and that's going to be specifically focused on automotive and the challenges of sourcing automotive products out of Mexico. If you're interested, please feel free to register, but that'll be tomorrow, focused specifically on automotive. So last, we have on the housekeeping Q&A format. Just want to get to that point again. The benefit of today's webinar is really going to be on the questions we get from all the attendees. We've got a lot of people registered, and I've already gotten questions from some of the people who've already registered. They've already sent questions to us. If you have questions, please go in the control panel, click the question box, and send it to me, and I will get to the speakers. If we have two, so we'll probably at this stage already have a lot. So if we can't get to your question, we will come to you after the webinar. Okay, so today I want to introduce the speakers. First off, if we would start Gary Czonka. Gary is president of Skojet Incorporated, based here in the U.S. Gary, if you would give a background, please.
Sure. As Alex said, I'm Gary Czonka. I'm the president of global manufacturing for Skojet. We are primarily an OEM component and contract manufacturer for companies in the U.S. and some of their subsidiaries over in Europe. We are located primarily in China, Mexico, and Colombia, South America, and we work with a lot of suppliers and partners overseas to provide not just components, but design services, logistics, warehousing, a full service to our customers.
That's great. Thank you, Gary. And then Carlos Flores, who is Senior Operational Manager for East West Associates in Mexico. Carlos, if you give background on yourself, please.
Yes, thanks, Alex. Well, thank you all for joining. And I built up about a little more than 20 years of experience in developing in those mostly industrial business in Mexico, steel and metal related in several segments such as heavy machinery, oil and gas, material handling, HVAC, energy, among others. So in the early 2000s, we saw a lot of action in companies like GE, Caterpillar, John Deere, establishing supply chain in Mexico. So 20 years after, this has evolved, and well, we're here to serve you, and our mission is to put our knowledge to your service to develop business in Mexico and other West Coast countries EWA has. Thank you.
That's great, Carlos. Thank you very much. And Fred, would you give a background on yourself, please?
Sure thing, Alex. So I'm an attorney at Harris Bricken. Prior to joining the firm in 2019, I lived in China for many years. I originally went to China as a foreign service officer and stayed behind in a variety of private sector roles. So much of what I bring to this discussion has been shaped by that experience.
That's excellent. All right. Well, thank you. Well, we're now going to turn the attention on to briefly discuss the current situation in China and Mexico, and then get right into the Q&A situation. Here's the laying out of the current state. This is not unusual for anyone to see. I think we know there's a clear trend to diversify supply chain from China to Mexico, right? For a variety of reasons, including pricing, logistics, the tariffs, overdependence on China, the geopolitical concerns, long-term lead times. There are some real sourcing opportunities in Mexico. We've been operating in Mexico for probably about 9 years. East West has. We're closer. I mean, obviously, two of the immediate ones are close proximity to U.S. North American customers, avoidance of U.S. China tariffs, However, there are some real challenges to Mexico. And I think one thing that everyone would agree on, including all the people who signed up, is that Mexico is certainly not a replacement for China. Just the size, scope, scale of China, it's just enormous. And the control over a number of raw materials is significant. So Mexico is not a replacement for China. No country is a replacement for China. But the question here is, how do you get around the challenges you've got in Mexico? Because there are some real opportunities. We know right now the Mexican vendors are way overwhelmed. I was on the phone with one 2 weeks ago, talking about he's getting 40 to 50 new requests on a weekly basis. And so they have begun to scale back. They're not giving indicative pricing as much as they used to. You really need to establish a relationship with them, but it's hard to do when they are running wide open. And your company is not General Electric. Some real challenges of operating on the ground in Mexico, and we're going to get right into those. In China, for example, this is just a quick slide of what's going on in the last 8, 10, 12 years of China getting a much tougher place to operate. Started off with the original labor costs going up, then you've got the growing regulatory complexity in China. You've got increased domestic competition, particularly for those companies who are operating on the ground in China and selling into the Chinese market. Slowing growth in the China market that was occurring even before COVID. And then you've got the China 2025 buy initiative, which is a bit protectionist, which is really hurting those companies who are in China, manufacturing and selling in China for the China market. You've got US-China tariffs, and then you've got obviously the situation with COVID. So having noted all that, noting kind of currently what's on the ground in China, let's turn now, noting what's on the ground in China and also this trend to Mexico. Let's kind of get into that. This is the Q&A discussion. And this will be again dependent. If you've got questions, I see some, we've already got some. Please feel free to ask questions and get it to me. So as we kind of get into this current, I wanted just to kind of set the stage for this. Gary, you and Carlos and Fred and I have been discussing this quite a bit in the previous weeks. I wanted just to ask you to comment, just from your perspective as president of SCOJET, and your thoughts about supply chain diversification and how to leverage Mexico. If you would kind of set the stage for that, of how you see it from SCOJET's point of view.
Absolutely. So we've been in China since 2004. We're well established there. About 5 years ago, we started looking at other manufacturing countries, low-cost manufacturing countries, looking for how to diversify. We spent some time at Mexico, moved on to other Asian Pacific areas like the Philippines. The concern now, as you've listed before in your previous slide, is the risks associated with not just China, but then what happens in the whole Asia Pacific area. So we came back a few years ago and set up an office in Mexico, started doing operations down there, diversified a little bit more, went to Colombia, South America. The biggest thing from my experience moving, I guess, is, as alluded to earlier, Mexico is not a replacement for China. There's a lot of positives. I'd say the biggest thing is if you have a product that you're currently making in the US and you just need more labor and you need the same level of quality, Mexico is a good place. If you're looking to get that huge cost savings, Mexico probably is not your place. Primary reasons for that are going to be your cost. A lot of the material is still coming either from Europe or from the Asia Pacific area. So as we all know, with the way shipping and logistics is right now, those costs are still high, and a lot of that material is coming from China itself. So between those two things, you're looking at probably a 30% premium just on materials. So I would say, and Carlos can probably maybe expand on that a little bit as far as where the materials are coming from and the costs associated with those.
Right. Thanks, Gary. I totally agree. And just to put it in perspective, Mexico, in the steel industry, Mexico has a national capacity for production of 20 million tons, and China has more than 1,000. So as you said, Mexico is not a replacement for China. China is way bigger, and their cost structure and their country project is very hard to beat in terms of labor and materials. And we know they are not a market economy. So, but change is unavoidable. And thing is that we all need to have a long-term vision of the changes. And yes, Mexico can be competitive in some commodities. Talking of the raw materials, right? Steel and plastics and aluminum, okay, can be depending on the alloy or the grade, can be competitive, but normally we'll have probably a 20 to 30% markup over what China has to offer. You can offset that with the logistics, but at the end, China is the reference. I mean, they are the baseline, and the combination of labor content, energy content, complexity, makes each component a better fit or not fitted to source from China to Mexico.
Yeah, and on that point, the question popped up based on your discussion. The question was for Gary and Carlos. Can you talk about why your companies, why your clients, why your customers are getting you all to do the work on the ground in Mexico?
Sure. A lot of our customers are not international. I guess that's the best way to describe it. It's not that they're not big companies, but anybody that is in this meeting and has done international knows that it's not just a matter of saying, I want an office and I'm going to start doing business in another country. There's a lot that goes into relationships. The language, we always say you have to speak 3 languages when you're doing the international business. The first one is English, which is your international business language, the native language of the country you're going to do business in, and then of course the technical language, whatever you're trying to produce, whether it's a physical product or a scientific a logarithm, you have to be able to communicate those technical words into the native language. So the reason we're brought in on a lot of this is because people don't want to build an entire supply chain themselves.
Hey, Carlos, would you agree with that?
Yes, I agree on that. And there is a cultural gap, language gap, technical gap that needs to be bridged, and therefore our service is valuable. I mean, otherwise you consider the resources that our customers will have to take in, the learning curve time, and the frustration because of getting to know will probably wear them down. So we're basically here to streamline, to simplify the process.
I've got a question that's come forward, and this is around. The question was around the most common problems of sourcing in Mexico, and I know Carlos, Gary, and Fred and I have talked about this. You all have talked about its capacity issues, its development of relationship with the Mexican suppliers, it's the volumes needed, and then sometimes it's accepting the price is going to be higher than China. Carlos, can you elaborate on that, if you would, on those 4 reasons or any other additional reasons you see they're kind of the core challenges of sourcing of these 5 key industrial components: aluminum extrusion, machining, castings, forgings, stampings, fabrication, and the injection molded and extruded plastics?
Yeah, yes, of course. And when I was introducing myself, I was mentioning that in the early 2000s, based on the first NAFTA industrial wave, we saw a lot of business developing in Mexico by companies like General Electric, like Deere, CAT, and their sourcing policy back on those days was to invest the human resources and technical resources to develop, Mexican suppliers, and they did a good job on that. So probably by 2005, we start to see this China boom, and we saw much of the business go away to China because of the cost, which is understandable. And this developed supplier vendor base, the suppliers found a way to fill their capacity. Okay, and as time went by, here we are again, and American companies, European companies are knocking the doors of these Mexican suppliers, and they have already filled their capacities with other business, and it's hard for them to invest in new capacity based on the experience that that business may go away. So to give you a quick example, here in my city, Monterrey, Mexico, John Deere was doing their counterweights for their agricultural tractors. Then they switched them to plate instead of casting, with a good cost saving, and then those moved to China. Okay, and now those counterweights are coming back. So if you go back and ask the same guy that 15 years ago saw that business part, and you're knocking the door again, well, he will be adamant to invest. So and that is part of the of what we need to transmit these Mexican vendors, that that this business is here for good. There's strategical reasons for that, not just base cost reasons for coming back. And yeah, that's kind of about it. So about these key industrial products, Mexico in metal stampings and fabrication, we have a good supplier base, a strong supplier base, developed supplier base, and probably then on plastics, it's also very competitive, and probably at the bottom will be forgings and machining.
Yeah, and Gary, would you agree with that?
I would. My experience in Mexico, we primarily source product in, say, like as low as 3,000 pieces up to 100,000 pieces. Those are kind of our key range for most of our customers. And the probably biggest issue sourcing out of Mexico is automotive and appliances were some of the first industries that went down to Mexico. And these factories are used to setting up, running jobs on a machine, and that job never comes off the machine. So there is not a lot of spare capacity down there. There's a willingness. We found that if we were willing to, say, purchase a piece of equipment, they would be willing to put it into their facility and run it for us, which, that helps us quite a bit without having to get into the labor issues and the overhead of a complete facility. But I definitely agree that capacity is probably going to be the biggest issue with new customers trying to break in without any relationships down there.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, about working with Mexican suppliers who got the capability, but they don't have the current capacity. We've talked about workarounds we've done with those suppliers. And we've talked we've all done as far as investing in Mexican suppliers or putting in machinery in there. Carlos, can you address that? And Gary, can you address that a little bit about the
Yes.
challenges of negotiating with Mexican supplier? The concern is there concern around IP if you put your own products in there?
Absolutely. I think there are several important things to consider in when doing business in Mexico in these times. And one is this partnership, a long-term strategy. I mean that the suppliers need to understand, okay, and they're willing to invest and co-invest for the benefit of both companies. So they see this long-term partnership, and that's precisely what Caterpillar and Deere and those companies did back in the 2000. I personally know a company where I think Caterpillar invested in 4 laser machines. Okay, and that company, started to do steel plate laser toll processing, and now they have 8 machines. And so I think we need to go back to basics in those learned lessons about co-investing, development, serious long-term relationships, of course, with the cost in mind. And that's why it's important to understand where Mexico is competitive and where it's not. So the effort is worth it.
And Gary, we've talked about putting machinery in these Mexican facilities and having them run that production for you. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I think, with Mexico, there's a lot of the same kind of entrepreneurial spirit that I saw in China, which is, they want business, they want to grow. And maybe, as Carlos mentioned, they're a little hesitant themselves to put a large investment in because we have a tendency as capitalists to take advantage of the situation as needed, and then when it doesn't suit us, to move on. But they have a keen interest in partnerships and developing those partnerships. There's usually space available in their facilities, and personnel is not an issue either. When it comes down to capacity, it's usually purely equipment related. One other thing I was going to touch on that you mentioned very briefly there, Alex, was like IP, intellectual property. I found every culture, as you do business around the world, we all understand the different areas and how they relate. Mexico, I found, is, and Carlos can speak more to this, but it's more of a family type of collective, and so you can form very good relationships. It's not like in other parts of the world where you can do product and that product can potentially either go out the back door of the same factory you're making, or somebody leaves that factory and takes that IP with them and then starts making your product somewhere else. Usually I've found that in Mexico, they're very focused on stable relationships and long-term relationships. So the risk of IP, and maybe I should have Fred talk about this more, but this is why you also need to have your legal contracts in place, right? But for the most part, if you've dealt with China and you've dealt with Mexico, or you haven't dealt with Mexico, I think you'll find the IP area much better in Mexico. That's definitely one of the pros.
And you haven't had that concern as far as putting the equipment in those facilities. You haven't had the concern that as you would if you're doing in Asia, of them making product offline and selling it as a competitor.
No. I will say though too, a lot of our product is made for specific companies. Not that you can't take and sell it in the aftermarket, but it's really designed for particular products. So it wouldn't really benefit a lot of our suppliers to do that anyways.
Yeah. Let me ask you, we've talked. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. Just wanted to add that there's I agree with Gary, and there's a cultural reason behind it. I mean, the Mexico has been a colony for many years, and their family values and honoring and long-term business relationship, and that's why we've been building cars for 80 years, and there isn't a single Mexican auto brand or maker right now. And if you compare that to China, it's the other way around. But China is it's an imperial country, so they see knowledge and the wealth that comes from that knowledge as as a people belonging. So they don't see in their culture, they don't see IP as IP. Okay, it's public property. So that's why you have this trend to to copycat and make good copies of products. And in Mexico, we don't.
Well, I wanted to kind of get into kind of teeing off that. We're talking about, say, we talked earlier, we've had discussions around metal stamping, fabrication, injection molded, extruded plastics. Those are to the best availability in Mexico, right? There's good availability for those products in Mexico. There's pricing related in those products, more so than some of the other ones. Can you talk a little bit about why in the stamping, fabrication, extruded plastic, injection molding is so readily is available in Mexico, and why it's a pretty good, Mexico is a pretty good source for those products? So Carlos or Gary, either one.
Okay, yes, I'll start. Well, I can about metal stamping and fabrication. Yeah, I mean there is a very well developed supplier base, and most of that is automotive or appliance requirement, some industrial too. So they know the cost structure. They have new equipment. They know how to run it. I mean, how to service it. For example, we know a company that is actually making presses, deep draw presses. They are doing those in Mexico, in Michoacan, and those compete with with the Bersons and those kind of European machines. So we even have the ability to make the presses in Mexico and develop the supplier-based quality, and most of the steel is also from Mexico.
That's
Fabrications, critical. So I think if you look at that, it's a metal stamping is it's a low labor content. It's a lot of machine and material content. So if you have the material and the equipment, and we're very close to the US, so it's that's why it is competitive. Same case with the fabrication. In fabrication, let's just think of a thicker gauge of steel, and it's the same case.
And what would you say is the reason for the injection molded and the extruded plastics? Why Mexico is a good source of that?
Exactly. That is the same case. Is without the without any injection and molding equipment fabricators already in Mexico, but the amount of companies that has been developed and they're exporting business, and also that the raw material availability, it comes from Europe or the US, and some from Asia, and some local too, makes that competitive too.
And what about we've talked about the tooling. We just got a question about that, about the tooling used for stampings and injection molding. Okay. Is that coming from China, or where is that coming from?
Yes, we were having a discussion with Gary yesterday, and we talked about this, and most of the tooling comes from China and Asia, and some from Spain. Gary?
Correct. Yeah, there's what we're finding is they have die maintenance shops. Again, I would say if you want to kind of understand Mexico's supply base right now, I mentioned this before, but it's built, and Carlos mentioned this, it's built around the appliance and automotive industry. So they're very efficient processors. They're automated processors, and they can do high volume. The tooling, we've struggled with finding tool makers in the areas, and usually they're very busy, and they're usually focused on like immediate need, where they can't wait for China to produce it, air freight it, get it over. So we found the same thing. The majority of tooling is coming from China or Europe right now.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry.
No, that's okay. And then kind of expanding a little bit on, the type of processes with the injection molding, stampings. Again, if you have an automotive base, there's usually the suppliers that support that automotive base there, and that's definitely true of Mexico. So, if you have any of those types of processes, you should be able to find it. Areas that are a little weak is if you're doing spin forming of metal, that is definitely limited down there. Most things are either stamped or like deep drawn, fabricated. There's not a lot of spin forming going on down there.
That's quite true. A couple of questions that popped up about is, so you're looking at metal stamping, you're looking at fabrication, you're looking at the injection molded plastics. They're pretty good, and there's availability there. There's certainly some capacity there, but even the capacity is quite full. Can you talk then, if you're dealing with someone looking at a metal stamping fabrication firm, and they've got capacity, they've got capabilities, obviously capacity, then what is your next step in trying to work with them? Is there an opportunity to work around that, or to get into that supplier, or do you just move on to the next supplier?
So we keep talking about capacity. Mexico, you're going to have to form relationships. You're not going to be able to go to one, and if the result isn't what you want, just jump to the next one, because you're going to find the next one is probably in the same situation.
Right.
If you can find like a mid-tier, somebody that's maybe second tier to automotive, they may have some capacity. And so if you're willing to work with, say, a smaller vendor, there's still capacity there, and there's still the interest. I don't want to say interest. Everybody is interested in doing business with the U.S. It's more about the ability, right? Whether it's financially or whatever, to meet those requirements. So as you step down in tier, you step down in capacity, is what I'd say. We haven't gone into this yet, on 5, but as far as qualified, the majority of the suppliers I've met down there and that I've toured their facilities, almost everybody at a minimum is like IATF certified, and then a lot of them are ISO certified as well. So their processes, their controls, the quality, I don't have to devote nearly the resources I do in Mexico that I do, say in the China operations, because they've been trained by the automotive and appliance industry for so long that it's kind of like inherent knowledge there. That would kind of be the best way to describe it. And that would probably be another thing. If you're, when we're talking about we want to divest from China, or we want to create a safety net in case something goes drastically wrong, right? That would be one of the things I say is a positive, is that you don't have to spend as much time with your partners there. They're used to communicating internationally. Almost everybody has native speakers there, multiple native speakers there. The other benefit is you're close, right? I can fly down in the morning, have an afternoon meeting, maybe get up in the morning, have another meeting, and then fly back to the US. My China operations, it's literally a 2-day trip just to get there, because I'm away from international airports a lot of times over there. So I have to fly in, take a train. Anyways, so those are some of the benefits, is that we're much closer, we're on the same time frame. So whether it's East Coast or West Coast, it's much more convenient. So those are things that people are going to have to factor into when they're thinking about what is the cost of moving to Mexico. There's a higher cost because of raw materials, but then there's these savings, such as flying time, communication, meeting times, not having to stay up, till midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning communicating with your suppliers. I would say those are some of the benefits too of using a Mexican supply base.
Yeah, I know our customers, and Carlos can speak to it. A lot of that is the lead time and the proximity of their customer base. I mean, they just know with COVID, that long stretch lead time can no longer be. There's not necessarily leaving China, but we've got to have closer suppliers than China. And Mexico is a great alternative. Can we speak a little bit what the question was, and I think it's a fair question. Both of you, Carlos and Gary, both of you all talking about how there's a volume issue, right, in Mexico, right? You get a lot of some of the largest suppliers who are pushing for higher volumes and want those higher volumes. And if you've got mid-sized volumes, you may not get the attention. I know, Carlos, you can speak to it. We've had good success finding suppliers that are not maybe the largest suppliers, but are more mid-sized suppliers, more mom and pop suppliers who are willing to play a more predominant role. Can you address, talk a little bit about that, about the volume issue and how to kind of deal with that? Because a lot of companies with supplies, and Gary, you mentioned yours, your spend is high, but it's not enormous. And then are you kind of stuck, or you need to look somewhere else?
Right. Wrapping up on the previous question, and bridging to this one, I think capacity can be available in Mexico. I mean, as Gary said, Mexican entrepreneurs are interested in doing business with American companies. They sure are, but they are just waiting for the right opportunity to arise. So it's important to develop the relationship, and then they will open the third shift, or they will add machinery to their available land. And we actually saw this recently in one of our East and West projects regarding castings. Out of the 3 companies that went to the final bid, the 3 of them were investing in additional capacity. So Mexican companies know that business is coming back from China, and they're preparing for that. So it's I think what's important to present ourselves in the right way, through the right channel, and with the right mindset, and there will be capacity for sure. And
That's a good point, Carlos.
Yes, I think that is the key. It's something that I want all the attendees to understand. There is capacity. It just needs to be built up in the proper way. We can help you with that. And of course, as we started, the volumes that China can handle are really, really big compared to what Mexico has to offer in terms of volume. So selecting the volume sizes and matching the companies, it's also a very important aspect to find that.
And you brought up that casting project we did. That's exactly right. I mean, we had to work with them. They were investing.
Yes.
Yes.
They were both. The 3 companies were investing. Right.
That's a very good point. And they were serious about it. They were committed to growing that. We got some more questions coming in, so let me keep asking. We talked a little bit about castings, machine parts, and forging. Those can sometimes be more expensive in Mexico. And it's a good segue in. Carlos, you were talking about the castings project we completed. Can you all talk a little bit about machine parts and forging, and it's a little more expensive in Mexico, and can you discuss that and discuss why?
Yes. Again, just listing these key industrial products, from more competitive in Mexico to less competitive in Mexico. We have on top plastics and injection molding, and metal stamping and fabrication. Aluminum extrusion will be in the middle, and I think castings are competitive too, and forging would be at the bottom. And that's because that's what I have seen. That's the energy and labor and available machinery. So if we compare Mexico forging capacity to Poland, which I know very well. I mean, it's Poland. Has way more developed forging industry, and that's right. And therefore the cost, the availability, and on machine parts, that is, I think, one of the worst cases, because if you compare the raw material and then the machine hour rate, and then if the component has heat treatment, I mean, that's also another factor where China is more competitive. So we can talk about 5 to 6-fold China to Mexico cost if you consider steel bar, the machine hour rate, and the heat treatment cost. So just to give you a quick figure, I think the machine hour in China for a CNC machining center is around the $12 neighborhood, and in Mexico it's close to the $40, depending on the size.
Yeah.
So okay, so then the other aspects come in. Maybe the dimensions, the shape of the part can be too hard to put in a container. Could make sense to do it in Mexico, and if there are small machine parts, you can put a lot in a container, and then the container price won't be an issue. So we have to be very specific and analyze the part, and see if it's feasible or not to do in Mexico. But that's why, I mean, the machine rates, material, and heat treatment, in that case, it's higher in Mexico, the three of them.
Well, and then the aluminum extrusion, you two have talked about the aluminum extrusion, right, as being kind of in the middle between the stamping, fabrication, extrusion, plastic. That's the best thing sorts out of Mexico. Forging stuff is probably the toughest, and aluminum extrusion kind of in the middle. Can you address why that is the case?
Yes. Aluminum extrusion. Aluminum is the raw material is available in Mexico, and the thing is that there are many commercial extrusion companies, not that many industrial companies, and so that's why we think it's not that competitive, is because all of these industrial aluminum extrusion companies are booked out.
Hey, Gary, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And again, my experience is the Mexican suppliers are again volume driven, so standard shapes, and we primarily focus on custom components. And so we've had difficulty getting capacity out of Mexico with extrusions for custom industrial shapes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Agreed.
yeah. That's fair. And that's why I think you've got to find those alternative suppliers or those second tier suppliers that have the capabilities and the capacity. We got into a question, so let me go through those. We had a question just pop up here. It was around the China controlling a lot of the raw material supply. And Gary and Fred and Carlos have been talking about that. And Gary, you were talking about how for example, China's controlling 80% of magnesium in the global supply chain. And can you talk about how that's affecting obviously the supply chain and the pricing going on in Mexico?
Yeah, with China being such a dominant producer of raw materials, our nickel has more than gone up 400%. Our magnesium has jumped again almost 400%. These are, I think, being driven again by not just the COVID, but we had the Olympics over in China, which they shut down a lot of polluting industries. So we've seen substantial price increases on raw materials coming out of China in the last year. And then, of course, when you tack on all of our shipping, you're seeing another, 200, 300% increase just in shipping costs. So I think the sooner we can develop more domestic and Latin American raw material suppliers, the better the separation, or I'll say the quicker the separation can happen if that's the path that's chosen. But yeah, the controlling interest by China in a lot of raw materials is definitely detrimental to the global supply chain.
Are we seeing that same thing like in resins? Are we seeing a lot of that coming in from the US?
What kind of happened with resins is even when they come out of Japan or South Korea, you've still got that 200 or 300% shipping surcharge on there, and so that's why even when it's not coming from China, those raw materials. Now we have operations in the U.S. of course, even Colombia has resin production. The problem is those are usually what I'll say are bulk materials, so they're very standard. But when you get into the specialized resins, like high temperature or just specialty plastics, they're usually coming from Europe, Japan, or South Korea, and so if they shut down for COVID, this is why there was such a supply chain shortage across all the industries in automotive. We saw with some of our Mexico suppliers doing automotive that we were having to get deviations for a lot of materials because we couldn't get them anywhere in the world, not just in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Let me kind of tee up that a minute. We got some more questions come in, so let me go through those. One was, it says, what are you seeing / hearing from Mexico suppliers regarding stability of the workforce, both engineers and operators? This has always been a challenge for us in China. Are the personnel more stable in Mexico? So Carlos, Gary, you all want to tackle that?
Yes, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah, go ahead, Carlos.
Thank you. Yes, actually the workforce availability is acceptable in Mexico, the turnover rates, and of course we have recently seen news about this General Motors new union happening, and I mean this is part of some changes that has to do with the labor law, and where it's important to address in the company or supplier selection, the union, which is handling an ex-supplier, and but there is no real problem in labor availability. I mean, we've seen some much stability, and none of our customers are really arguing about that. So the important thing is that the age of Mexico, the amount of new Mexicans born, and don't know the word in English, but this the aging of the population, it's stable. So we're keeping a steady flow of young guys or young people that can keep up with the jobs, with the blue collar jobs especially.
Yeah, Gary, you finding the same thing? We've not heard an issue with that.
Yeah, I would say, with a lot that's going in South America, Mexico is kind of benefiting because, they're getting waylaid in Mexico, and some people are deciding to stay there. And Carlos, maybe you can address this as well, but my understanding is the Mexican president is actually trying to encourage people to stay in Mexico to help grow their economy. They're not actually trying to push them out. So there is a large labor pool down there. It's really capacity constraints have to do with equipment, availability, not the willingness or the worker capacity, I would say, in Mexico.
Yes, Gary, you're right. That comment is right on spot. We've seen many people come from the south border and staying here, and they are competing with the Mexican labor. So I think it's a good thing from that point of view. Right.
Yeah. We've got a company popped up, was asked about, one is about operating a location in Mexico, where the place is located in. Obviously, that's really more of a site selection, which we've done, doing a site selection search on the ground in Mexico. He was asking here as part of it, is there any concern regarding personal safety for business in Mexico? And obviously you get that question, and Carlos, Gary, you all are down there all the time. Carlos, you're living there. Is there an issue on personal safety any more than any other region? If you're staying out of certain areas where there's more of there's maybe more of an issue with the cartels.
Absolutely. I mean, there are certain areas and regions of the country which are you have to be really careful there. But that is not the case of the whole Mexico, especially the industrial areas. So, for example, the Monterrey, Saltillo, Querétaro areas, Mexico City areas. I mean, they don't have this safety or security issues. I mean, there are some states, especially in the south west, okay, so that you can have some risk there, but that is not the industrial case, the industrial cities case. Yeah. So no real threat from there.
Yeah, I mean,
Gary, you found the same thing?
Yeah, I would kind of agree with Carlos. It really depends on the area. Our operations are also based out of Monterrey. Our office is there. Now I have visited customers on the border, and whether this is just a precaution because of the size of the business, but we have taken vans, security vans into the factories. So yeah, I would just say if you're looking to set up operations, definitely there's a lot of information, even on the U.S. government sites about areas to be aware of. But I would also agree with Carlos that when I've been in areas that are industrialized and let's just say better off, that there's less of a concern. Typically, well, honestly, I've never gone to Monterrey with any type of security. I fly alone, and I don't have any issues. And I'll just tell everybody, which should be common sense, but again, don't showcase anything. Don't act, don't flash money. Don't flash expensive things. Just be a normal worker, and for the most part, you're going to have no problems.
Yeah, we've been there.
Yeah, and especially the first time that you come to Mexico, it's important to be accompanied by a Mexican, by a local person, so you can know your way around and know the where to go and where not to go.
Yeah, I mean, Carlos, you're doing that for a lot of East Coast people coming down there, and that's just helpful just to make it more efficient. Look, I got a couple of questions. One about the one question came in here around the concrete sourcing and forming business. Is this a business, the mixing and paving industry? Is this a business and that's got some representations of volume in Mexico? I know, Carlos, you got quite a bit of experience in that area.
Yes, I can answer that. And there are American and European concrete mixer companies established in Mexico, as well as a supplier base. And we also developed there's a special steel for the concrete mixers, the AR200, that either comes from Nucor or SSAB in the US. But yes, there is capacity here for that.
Right. And another one popped in. It was talking about, and I know it's 12 o'clock, so if everybody needs to leave, please leave. Thank you very much. It's a hard stop at 12 o'clock. We don't want to keep anyone on, but we got some additional questions just popped in. So Carlos and Gary, if you all don't mind answering a few more questions that popped in, we'll keep answering them. But the webinar is officially over, but I don't want to shortchange all the questions we got. So please feel free to hop off if you need to. Another question just popped in about Mexican vendors. and manufacturers, and really about the compliance and sustainability audits. Carlos, Gary, you all both very active in doing those. I know our clients need them. Can you talk a little bit about doing supplier audits, and then also the sustainability audits with the various vendors and manufacturers, and many of them have been doing this for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, again, they're used to, again, when you get to a certain level of supplier, right? They're all IATF. They're all doing a lot of automotive business, and so they're used to these types of requirements. They're also requiring their sub-tier suppliers to meet those requirements. So my experience is it's been it's been much better than China. Let me put it that way. Now, again, everybody's requirements are a little bit different. Some people are going to require higher requirements depending on the chemicals they work with and the materials they work with. So again, I would just, the suppliers are very open to communication, and so if they don't have what you need, my experience is they'll work with you to get what you need if they don't have it. So, Carlos, you want to expand on that?
Yeah, and I totally agree. And basically, and as I said a couple of times, from the late 90s, there has been a lot of company or supply development from these big companies and from the US. So I would say that back in 2000, meeting, with the environmental health and safety, was a challenge. But 20 years after, most of this supplier base, which is automotive or heavy industry or appliance related, are well aware of, meeting these requirements. They understand them. And of course, when we run these supplier assessments and evaluations, we of course can find some gaps, and but you just have to put an action plan for them to fill the gaps and the business on the table, and that will happen. But it's important to address, especially especially at this middle-sized company that we're targeting, which probably have the potential. So that is the way to do it.
Yeah, that's a good point. The mid-sized that we are targeting.
Yes.
Here's another question popped in about Mexico's capacity to provide deep draw parts. Does the manufacturing industry in Mexico have the capacity for deep draw?
My experience, yes.
Yes, my experience too is yes, too.
I was thinking that.
Please ask please ask the attendee to elaborate on the press size, and we can take a look at it. But yes.
Yeah, perfect. We have one other question, or another question that's here that just popped up as far as talking about some of the challenges of how to establish relationships with these Mexican suppliers, considering that they're getting called on constantly by primarily Western companies and who are trying to diversify from China into Mexico, and they're pounding these Mexican suppliers who are well overwhelmed with this. The question is, how do they get around that, right? I mean, unless they're not, this client says, we're not General Electric, we're a mid-sized company trying to get in with some suppliers. We're not hearing back from the suppliers. It looks like they're either calling them or phone calling them or emailing them. What suggestions do you have to get around them? Carlos, obviously you're there and you're calling for East West people. You know some of these people, but do you have suggestions for someone who's just trying to get in for the first time? Or Gary, do you have thoughts on how to help these people get in?
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. I think engaging with these companies first with the previous information that is a product industry volume match. That's point number one, and we can help you with that. And then making this approach in this partnership long term, here to stay, win-win basis, that it's very important too. Okay, and of course, as Gary said, developing the relationship, which is very important in our Mexican culture.
So what I'd expand on, coming from the type of person, the way I set up operations is I usually will identify, I'll have some relationship and some personnel already there. That always helps. But if you're trying to do it remotely, the thing that all suppliers want, right, is they want to understand the business benefit. So when you're talking projects with your potential suppliers, we're in the US, we're used to supplier customers, okay? And in international business, I feel more than anywhere, you have to understand partnerships versus a supplier customer relationship. And what I mean by that is they don't know you, okay? You're in a faraway country. Nobody has any idea who you are, how reliable, how trustworthy you are. So the first thing is, don't expect, like in the US, where you send over an RFQ package and expect somebody to devote, days of research into getting material, quoting it, to send it back to you, and then you make a decision about whether you want to do business with them. If you're not going to use a service like, East West or something like that, you can maybe reach out to US Chamber of Commerce. Usually they have people that can make some introductions for you. Eventually you're going to have to go there and meet with people, but I would say the best thing you can do if you really want to start relationships with suppliers down there is to start forming a relationship through communication first, and don't expect dropping an RFQ package onto somebody and wanting them to spend a whole bunch of time. It's not going to work in Mexico because they're busy, they're at capacity, and they don't want to divert resources to something that they're not sure they're going to get. And we have a tendency in the US to throw around RFQs because it's easy for us. And then we're just expecting, well, if they want the business, they'll do it. But you have to understand the business atmosphere you're going into there. And so you need to build that relationship. And I would just say, start communicating, send a few messages. Hey, how are you? I'm interested in talking about a relationship. That's kind of what I would recommend people do is start building relationships. And you'd be surprised, because sometimes even if that supplier can't do it or they don't want to, whatever the case, when you build relationships, they may recommend somebody else to you. We've had that happen where, we've had, just because of volume, somebody else will say, well, we can't do it, we don't have the capacity, but I know this shop. And then you're being referred, okay? So now you've got an introduction instead of trying to, start a relationship cold, and that will help you as well. I hope that helps.
It does. Carlos, obviously you're calling on these people on behalf of East West clients. You already know a lot of them. You've been in the business of manufacturing there. Are you seeing in the last 2 years, 3 years, 1 year, it is much harder to get into these suppliers, right? If you don't know them, do you think that's going to go on for another? Both of you think that's going to go on for another year, 2 years, 3 years? That we're going to have this kind of over accelerated pace that we see on the ground now in Mexico?
Yes, I see that continuing as more businesses will be look for a place in Mexico, and the volume, in the pandemics, probably the first 6 months, we saw a decline, an overall decline in the business. But then probably after 2020 H2, we saw business and demand skyrocket, and it has been steady there. So if these suppliers, as Gary said, they're busy, and they are looking for the right opportunity for someone to come in and explain the reasons for being there and explain his business, rather than an email with an RFQ and an RFI. So I see that staying.
Okay, all right. Well, look, I don't want to keep people on. I know we're already almost 15 minutes past due. If anyone has the additional questions we have, we can come back to. We can get to you individually. Well, I guess one final question was around, just popped in, was around specifically the lawn and garden business. And does Mexico have a consumer goods lawn and garden business? I'll ask that as a final question that just popped up. Do either one of you know much about lawn and garden? I know we've done a lot of fair amount of sourcing down there for certain pieces, particularly the lawn and garden and the appliance sector. Either one of you all want to comment on that?
I mean, I guess, could we get clarification? Are they looking for like contract manufacturing, right? I'm actually very large into the lawn and garden industry, and I know there's been a large loss of contract manufacturing, primarily because U.S. manufacturers can't do it cheap enough, and there's been a lot of anti-dumping recently in lawn and garden from China, and so it's basically just killed all capacity, and people are looking for I guess new locations to manufacture. If they're talking about components, components can be made anywhere, but if they're specifically referring to contract manufacturing, there is contract manufacturing, and I'll let Alex or Carlos speak more to that. But if you're looking for somebody, say, already established that is doing it, I would say no. There's ag, and there are people making components, but as far as contract manufacturing, say like a $99 lawnmower, no.
Right. Yep. Speaking of that contract manufacturing, here's another question that's popped up, is around shelter companies, and the question was, if you're looking for contract, this company has got contract manufacturing, they're looking to just establish their own manufacturing, and they were asked a question of doing that versus a shelter company. I know we were just talking yesterday about some of the issues on shelter companies. Can you two address that, if you would, please?
Carlos, go ahead and talk a little bit about what we mentioned or had that discussion when I was asking you about the shelter companies and kind of the taxes and the profit thing that's going on right now.
Oh, yes, right. We were discussing that shelter companies were they were an important startup figure back in the late 90s, as they allowed a foreign company to start doing business, fast in Mexico and with compliance. But as time went by, one of the Mexican labor laws, which has to do with a profit sharing, in the Mexican law, Mexican established companies are entitled or forced to share 8 to 10% of their profit in the second quarter of the year. So somehow these figures found a way to avoid paying that. And as the labor reformed like 8 years ago, they started to make changes to these shelter companies and the way they are established, and they are pushing companies to not to outsource labor, but to actually hire the labor directly, precisely to meet these legal labor requirements. So that's why it has been changing, and that's why the shelter figures are having a rethinking They're reinventing themselves as real estate companies and service companies rather than labor management companies.
And Gary, do you see that also, as I understood, that if you've got a problem with one, these shelter companies have different holdings underneath it, and the government views if you have a problem with one holding, it can affect the other, and that's a risk for someone who's going through that.
Correct. So, the way shelter companies work, because this is something we looked into as well. Again, for each company, I'm not trying to discourage anybody one way or the other, but I'm trying to make people aware because, these are the things I learned as I progressed in Mexico. So the shelter companies, they may have 10 companies, let's just say A, B, C, and D, right? That they're making, they're acting as a shelter for. If one of those companies, let's say company B, ends up with an issue with their accounting for some reason, there are some protections. I'm not saying that it's just a free-for-all or anything. There are some protections that could push back onto the accounting arm, but you could potentially get kind of dragged into company B's issues with, even though you're company A or company C, because they're all lumped under the same umbrella in essence. So that's just something you'd want to understand if you go in with an umbrella, is how is your accounting, your taxes, the filings that you're doing, how they're kind of protected versus using setting up something on your own or using a third party.
Okay. All right. Well, we're now officially way over. We're a little 15, 17 minutes past, so we will stop. We've answered a lot of the questions. I don't want to hold people on too long. First of all, Fred, and I obviously want to thank Carlos and Gary for being the speakers on this event. Y'all did a great job answering a ton of questions. We had basically an hour of Q&A, which is exactly what the purpose of this is for. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to give me a call. If you want to contact us, I can please send me an email and I can get to Fred and I can get back to you. Carlos and Gary, thank you all very much for taking the time. And this officially ends the current webinar for today. And then the third webinar is tomorrow, specifically on automotive. Again, thank you everyone for participating. We look forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.